Hello and welcome to the DMH Stallard Employment Law Podcast. My name is Abigail Mayno. As employers will know, there was a dramatic shift in the way we worked in March 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 national lockdown. Overnight, office workers across the country set up from home, and many have stayed there to varying degrees since, despite the lockdowns having ended. Indeed, it is a rare employer who's mandated a 5-day working week in the office for most roles, and it's increasingly expected as the norm by employees to have significant portions of their working week based at home. But has there been a shift in what employers want or need in recent times? According to reports, Amazon has asked its admin team to return to the office full-time from January 2025, rather than working 2 days from home. And Tesco's has asked its staff to increase their office attendance, and JD Sports has asked its head office employees to work from the office for at least 4 days a week, rather than whenever they wish. So what impact does it have from a legal and commercial perspective to get people back into the office? Are we about to embark on a shift back to office norms of pre-pandemic times? So with me to discuss the future of office attendance are Greg Burgess, a partner in the employment group at DMH Stallard. Greg has a wealth of experience in advising businesses in complex workforce management issues, including the sorts of issues we'll be discussing today. And Will Walsh, also a partner in the employment group with many years of experience advising organisations, large and small, across a variety of sectors, and will regularly assist employees with fine-tuning their approach to managing complex workforce issues. So Greg, thinking about these issues, is there any hard evidence yet of positive or negative impacts of hybrid working?
I wouldn't say we have hard evidence yet. We certainly have evidence of how popular hybrid working remains within UK organisations. What we've seen is around 50 to 60% of people doing their work not from home, and that's been the case since the pandemic came to an end, which leaves up to 50% who are doing some sort of hybrid or home working arrangement. The latest stats I saw suggested that about 10% are pure home workers now, which leaves around 40% of people doing some sort of hybrid working. So it's still very, very common and popular. Yes, we see more in the press about some employers starting to clamp down or to enforce more strict policies. But the actual evidence of the positive and negative impacts hasn't come through just yet. One of the leading academics on this is a guy called Nick Bloom, who's a professor of economics at Stanford University over in California, but he's a British-based professor. He's been writing about hybrid working for some time, well before the pandemic, and he produced some research in January of this year along with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which suggested that employees value hybrid working as much as they would value an 8% pay rise. And that struck me as a pretty significant and telling comparison. You know, if you have the choice between an 8% pay rise and hybrid working, then that research suggests that the hybrid working offer and availability remains very important, and that seems to be the case from conversations that I and colleagues in the team here have with our employer clients.
That's interesting. So Will, thinking about that further, if employees seem to be valuing hybrid working, what are employers beginning to say in your experience in terms of getting people back into the office or leaving things as they are?
Yeah, I mean, over the last 12 months or so, and certainly more recently, we've certainly seen an increasing trend amongst clients who are looking to get employees back into the office more. That doesn't necessarily mean going back to the office 5 days a week, but this tends to be businesses where employees either don't work in the office at all at the moment, or minimal attendance, maybe 1 day a week or thereabouts. I've certainly seen an increase in employers trying to get employees back into the workplace 2 days a week, 3 days a week, still embracing some hybrid working, but certainly a lot more than in the past. It's possible that it's been brought into more focus as property leases come up for renewal, and they're starting to review the needs from that perspective and think about about their workforces and where people will be working. But other reasons that I've certainly seen quoted is concerns to a degree about performance, not necessarily in terms of employees performing badly to the extent of needing formal performance managing processes, but just in terms of performance levels of work not being quite what they were pre-pandemic, and a sense that more time spent face-to-face in the office could help to improve that. There's certainly been concerns, again, it depends on businesses, but in terms of seeing the benefit of collaboration face-to-face, that's just less effective working remotely and through Teams meetings. So that can be a sort of a clear positive that employers see of people spending more time in the office. Along similar lines, development of junior staff. If we think about it, it's been 4.5 years now since the COVID pandemic, and an awful lot of, in that time, new starters will have been in businesses, need training up, and it's very different perhaps than it was in the initial months post-COVID when we all went home. Obviously things move on, develop, and those junior people coming through need training up. And again, it's not nearly as effective but doing that remotely rather than learning on the job in the presence of their colleagues. So that's certainly something that business has been looking at. And then from a well-being perspective, just a question of possible lack of social interaction for remote workers. So those who are working almost entirely remotely, sometimes starting to feel a little bit excluded from those who are voluntarily going to the office more, starting to see some gaps and divisions amongst teams, and sort of benefits for people seeing their colleagues face to face. Of course, not all colleagues will see it that way. I'd be delighted to see each other face to face all the time. But again, I think people are seeing a clear benefit of spending at least more time face to face with people. So that seems to be the current trend that I've seen with my clients.
Yeah, very interesting. I think we'll dig into some of the issues to consider if employees want to consider getting people back into the office more frequently a bit later on. But Greg, are there any other issues that have arisen that you've come across with home working and hybrid working?
I mean, the main thing we see is around well-being, which Will just touched upon, and making sure that as employers, you're looking after the well-being and health and safety of your staff. Things such as employees not taking days off sick, so they'll be unwell for a couple of hours and then say they're well enough to work for the rest of the day. That's become a bit of a grey area, because naturally we think that if we're at home and we're unwell, we will take the time off, but we'll get back onto work as quickly as possible. And that's linked also to something that's been in the news quite a lot recently, which is this right to disconnect. Now, in the Labour manifesto for the recent general election, they said that they would introduce a right to disconnect from work, so that you don't have to engage or answer emails outside of your normal working hours. But actually, when the government published their employment rights bill only last week, there wasn't any specific mention of a timing for the introduction of that right to disconnect, albeit that they have issued a press release saying that they will still introduce it, but we just don't know when. So issues around sickness, around disconnecting from work come to the fore when people are working remotely, and it's an area which I think in time we will see some further regulation from the Labour government on, although it's not top of their priority list. And then just one other thing that there was a lot of noise about at the start of the pandemic with people working from home was about monitoring of staff. And we were hearing reports of software providers who were providing software to be installed on computers for remote workers being increasingly used. I've read reports that there was a 50% use in monitoring software being used by employers. Now, I'm not sure about those figures, to be quite frank, and I don't know whether they're more of a US thing than a UK. Certainly in my experience, I haven't had clients either come to me to say, what do? We want to put this software on people's systems and how do we go about it? nor have I had clients come to me and say, we've put the software in, we've got concerned about a person who's disappearing for certain lengths of time during their working day, and we want to take action against them. So I haven't seen that myself. I don't know if you, Abby, or any others in the team you know of have had that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I've only had it to a very limited degree. Funnily enough, with a US owned company and their UK operations want to do some monitoring, but I think they largely backed away from that when they thought about the sort of GDPR data protection aspect of it. Don't know about you, Will, have you had any experience with that?
Not very much. Again, as Greg says, it was a concern certainly in the early days that could happen. In fact, the only example I can think of was actually in the opposite, with someone who had returned to the office and this was in the very early days of post-COVID, that they decided to take flexibility to an extreme and disappear in the middle of a meeting to go for a walk in the middle of a meeting. That's what they've become accustomed to. But that was in person. But yes, I haven't seen any particular problems with that type of issue.
Yeah. Okay, so if employers do want to get people to return to the office, well, what do they need to think about? Probably from looking at it from a legal and a non-legal perspective.
Yeah, there's definitely practical issues, possibly over and above the legal ones. I mean, it has to be said, obviously, for some employees, a return, or not just for themselves but more of their colleagues, will be very welcome. I think there is certainly among some a little bit of a degree of fatigue setting in. It was all quite sort of new and exciting 4.5 years ago, and Zoom and Teams calls and all the rest. There are certainly plenty who have become a little bit weary of that and actually are enjoying more face-to-face interaction and would welcome their colleagues being there with them. But for others, of course, it's not quite so simple. I mean, from a practical point of view, there are many people who have become very accustomed to their way of working over the last 4.5 years, and they've adapted their lifestyles accordingly, whether that's childcare arrangements. It may even be that they've moved house to a different part of the country because they don't have to have the higher cost of living. For example, if they were based near London previously, they've moved away from the city because they don't have to do the commute so much anymore. So suddenly, telling those same people that they have to go back to something similar to pre-pandemic levels will be practically very difficult for those people to manage. And I think the expectation for many employees is that the lifestyle that they've become accustomed to will continue going forward. So there's that clear sort of practical problem there. I think businesses need to think about retention issues. So for the same reasons, if they enforce return to work, certainly full-time return to work in the office, are they going to start to lose staff who expect or need something different? And connected with that in terms of recruitment as well, not just losing your current staff, but sort of how attractive you might be as a new employer, not to mention the fact that if you can adopt a more flexible pattern, at the very least a hybrid working pattern, then you're potentially opening up job applications to a wider pool of candidates. So people who previously wouldn't have been able to work for you because they live too far away, potentially opens up opportunities. So there's all of that for businesses to consider. The other thing as well, of course, is that for those who are looking to ask people to return to the office more, and certainly absolutely, if they're asking most to return nearly full time, is leading by example. It can be a real problem if those at the top, managers in particular, are the ones who turn up to the office the least. So they're asking their employees to come, and they see the people who should be leading the way doing their own thing, and don't feel that the same rules apply to them. So again, obviously consistency will be absolutely key. But from a legal perspective, I think the biggest problem for most is the sort of uncertainty, if you like, from a contractual perspective, because very few businesses changed written contracts of employment 4.5 years ago. It was thrust upon us. Everyone by law had to stay away from the workplace, barring those key workers and those who couldn't work from home. And no one thought to change contracts at the time. It was always expected to be a fairly temporary measure. So there was no particular need to change written contracts. And that's remained the case since then. So the vast majority of people now saying to their employees that they should return to work after in the office more after 4.5 years, those people's contracts will still have the office stated as their contractual place of work. So from the business point of view, that's going to be the starting point of saying your contract says you work in the office. So therefore, that's what you must do. And that introduces, though, this sort of slightly grey area in the law of employees potentially saying, well, I've worked from home for 4.5 years now, so is it not now part of my contract through custom and practice? Has my place of work actually varied? So my contractual place of work, even though not written down in the contract, is actually my home. And that's certainly a tricky one for employers to try and tackle and deal with going forward when they're engaging with staff about this return.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's not as clear cut as just going back to the contract. And of course, many employers will have introduced policies as well, which employees may sort of hang their hat on to say, well, the policy says I can do this, and that's what I've been doing. Greg, Will's flagged some important issues to consider if employers are thinking about getting people back to the office more. If they are considering it, how would they go about it?
Well, the starting point, feeding off what Will was just saying, is what does the contract say? So that's the first thing that we would look at. And just to Will's point, I mean, interestingly, I've done a couple of contract reviews in the last year where I've looked at the place of work clause, which is the original pre-pandemic place of work clause, which says you'll work at our office in X and you'll work at such other locations as we may reasonably require. And even though they've had hybrid working since then, and so arguably customer practice says that the place of work clause now is a hybrid working clause, I've had clients say to me that we want to keep the place of work as the stated office, just because they want to set the belief, if you like, in the people's minds that they are still primarily office-based workers, albeit with some flexibility around it. So I have seen, doing contract reviews recently, that's very much a live issue to think very carefully about what that place of work clause says. And equally, I've drafted hybrid working place of work clauses in contracts as well. So the starting point is always what's in the existing contract. Then we talk about the custom and practice and what's been happening in practice on the ground. And if you are going to try and force office attendance either completely or to a higher degree, yes, you would go through a consultation with your staff over that. You need to be aware that if you seek to enforce it, they could then make flexible working requests, as they've been able to do for a number of years, but they can absolutely make those flexible working requests. We did think whether the Employment Rights Bill, the Labour's Employment Rights Bill announced last week, might provide more ammunition for employees in relation to flexible working requests. It's given them a little bit more ammunition. It's made it slightly harder for employers to refuse, but not significantly harder. So I don't think the new flexible working changes will make a dramatic effect in terms of place of work. In terms of what we've seen in practice, and Will talked about leading by example. One of the well-publicised examples was Santander, who they had a recommendation of 2 to 3 days per week. Their chief exec has come out in the press and said he would only have taken this job because it was a hybrid role. He lives in Harrogate. Their head office is in London and Milton Keynes. And it allows him to work from Harrogate, I'm guessing Mondays and Fridays, and then travel down for the middle part of the week. So it's a really important thing. And yes, leading by example is important. And that was just one example I'd seen of the leader of the business being very clear that it was a key part of attracting him to the role, that there was this degree of flexibility. And then just in terms of other examples we've seen of what businesses are trying to do, in the press recently, the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics, They've tried to move from a model which said we empower our staff to make their own decisions. It's fully flexible. You attend the office when you like. That was their post-pandemic position. They were trying to move to a requirement of at least 40% of working time in the office. And now the PCS union, which is one of the main public sector trade unions, they've called strike action and are going through the process of balloting their members for strike action. So that was quite an extreme example where they had that full flexibility, which we do see with some employers, but less so. Most employers are coming somewhere between the 2/3 days a week in or out of the office, if you see what I mean, either way round.
Yeah. Gosh, so there's a lot to think about if you're considering making a change to the current hybrid working, if that's what employers are doing. I just wonder whether either of you think there'll be a reversal of home working. I get the sense probably not from what you've both said, but do you think there'll be any change in the trend towards the balance of office and home working moving forward? Don't know if you've got any thoughts, Will.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with your point there, Abby. I think again, from what I've seen, obviously every business is different, and there have been those examples in the press about returning to work almost full time. I think for most, I think hybrid working is here to stay. I think we're in this phase right now where employers are looking to strike the right balance. So the clients that I have who are looking at this, very few are going the way of you must all return to work full time. It's trying to choose the right number of days in the office. The reasons for return to office are very valid. Equally, I think businesses are recognizing the benefits of at least some home working, whether it's even just coming down to office space and rent and those sorts of things, but also just the benefits to workforce in terms of expectations, flexibility, the benefits of not wasting time of commuting, wider selection pool for candidates, and all the rest. So yes, my view is that businesses are generally settling at choosing between perhaps almost 50-50 or 2 days out of 5 in the office, depending on the needs of their business. So a bit more in the office, but not significantly so. And I think that's going to be the pattern. And once it settles down, again, with exceptions being dealt with via flexible working requests and all the rest, but otherwise, I think it was going to be a question of that that hybrid pattern.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Is that broadly in line with your thoughts, or do you have any other perspectives potentially?
Well, the direction of travel that I've seen recently, certainly from some clients and some of the stories we've seen in the press, is where a policy was introduced to allow some element of hybrid working with an expectation of, let's just say, at least two days a week in the office. But in practice, there's been lots of flexibility and there hasn't been an enforcement of that policy. What I've seen in recent months is more employers saying, well, okay, we tried to introduce it on a softly basis. It wasn't a absolute requirement. We now want to make it a requirement, and that just creates some issues in terms of navigating that. Not so much from a legal perspective, because you should be in a reasonable position to enforce it if you want to, but it's the hearts and minds piece. It's the well-being, and it's the engagement and motivation of staff, because the expectation levels of flexibility are so high for all staff these days that in actual fact you're a pretty foolish employer if you're going to enforce, let's just say, pure office working in roles which quite clearly could be effectively done in a hybrid model. So that's the decision. Most employers are wise to that. Most employers will try to be flexible, but equally they've got to make sure that their staff are fully productive, that they're fully supported and developed and supervised in the work that they do. So it's balancing everything, and it will go on being a difficult balance. You've got to make the right decision for your business, which is going to fit with what your business needs and what your staff expect.
Absolutely. Yes, I can see that. I can certainly see that there's your point, Greg, that there's a lot more discussions about enforcement of expectations going forward. That was really interesting. I think we'll keep a close eye on what happens with some of the larger employers in the press to see if this is more of a shift or generally more enforcement of policies and procedures that were already there and perhaps haven't been implemented in the past. So thank you all. Thank you both for your really valuable contributions and everyone for listening. Just a reminder to follow our podcast on LinkedIn or wherever you get your podcasts.